Okay, well, I'm very pleased to introduce Sharon, who's a professor in the sustainability section of SoMAS, and she's actually the faculty director.
Yeah.
As opposed to
just a regular person.
Okay. All right.
If you're an EHI student, I get to help you along your way.
Okay. And she's actually has a PhD in anthropology and worked a lot with baboons and what they eat, and that's eventually evolved into the work she does now, which focuses on soil health and what we eat and all the unfortunate chemicals that are used to enhance food production, but we shouldn't be eating. So without further ado, I'll let you there.
All right, well, nobody ever accused me of having an indoor voice anyway. All right, so thank you guys all very much for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. Today, because I love to talk about this topic, this is one of my favorite, I'm actually talking about two of my favorite topics in the world to talk about, theoretically. The first thing that I want to tell you guys about is Roundup, which is a weed killer. And in the literature, when people study it, they study it in two forms. The ecotoxicologists, like myself, we study Roundup, the formulation. It comes in a lot of flavors. But the active ingredient is called glyphosate. And I'm going to use the words interchangeably throughout the lecture, but I want you to be aware of the fact that there are differences. When I say Roundup, I'm talking about the formulation. When I'm talking about glyphosate, I'm talking about the active ingredient. So my first story, I'm telling you two stories. My first story is about Roundup and its negative impact, potentially negative impact on the environment, and its impact on non-target organisms. It's a great story. That's not it. The next story I'm going to tell you about is about the undergraduate students here at Stony Brook University, and I'm going to talk about their impact on the environment and how they impact non-target organisms. They actually have a positive role. So Roundup is so safe and so effective that you can send your teenagers out on a Saturday and without a mask and without gloves. You can ask them to mix the Roundup with the water and use your spray, and he can spray all of his dandelions and poison ivy if you really want a biodiversity index of 1, which this family actually wants. The other thing is there are lots of YouTube videos that can show the homeowners how to mix it together and what to spray it on. Roundup as a formulation is the second most commonly used herbicide, weed killer in the United States. Actually, that might be globally. That means a lot of people are using it. But the people who really think that Roundup is the bee's knees are conventional farmers. This is an image of a tractor spraying Roundup on a young soybean field. The reason that farmers think that Roundup is so awesome is because back in 1998, Monsanto introduced onto the market this crop right here, which is our friend, the Roundup Ready soybean. And the Roundup Ready soybean is really awesome because you can be a farmer and you can plant your soybeans, and usually if you are a farmer and the rain comes, you're like, oh, God, I'm glad it's watering the plants, but the weeds are going to be out tomorrow. So the farmers don't care anymore because they can just send their tractors out with their spray. A lot of these tractors are almost all completely automated. They spray it with Roundup. The weeds die. It's almost no work. Roundup is pretty cheap. Monsanto started there. They moved into corn. This is canola. This is cotton. They have a slew of other Roundup Ready crops that are also available if you want to buy it, which is a challenge in and of itself. You can ask me about that at lunch. The convenience of these seeds is, I don't know, supported by Monsanto's white papers, which came out in 2000 and again in 2002, the first ones. Monsanto calls this chemical environmentally benign. It's got low toxicity, according to the white paper. It's got low mobility. It's water soluble. It breaks down super fast in soil and in water. These are all traits that we really value in our herbicides because we want our herbicide to stay where we spray it. We want it to break down quickly. We do not want it in our waterways. We don't want it in our groundwater. We don't want it in our rivers. We don't want it in our soil. We want it to spray it, kill the weeds, and go away. That would be awesome. And Monsanto told us that that's what they were giving us. They weren't the only ones because after Monsanto put out the white paper, scientists did what they do, and these are two pro-Roundup papers that came out. I don't know if you can read the name of this one, but this paper, which came out in 2008, is so pro-Roundup, it's called Mini Review, Glyphosate, a once-in-a-century herbicide. A once-in-a-century herbicide because it's the bee's knees. Okay, so this is the data that supports the farmer's love for Roundup right here. This red line is the overall conventional farming agricultural use. This is a little out of date. This ends at 2010, so I think this data set ends at 2008. But if you look at the more updated things, the red line continues to go up. And you can see where we're using it in the United States. It's not a big impact on the eastern seaboard, but if you come from the Midwest, if you come from Illinois, you are, in fact, swimming in Roundup applications all along the Mississippi Delta there. When Monsanto introduced this particular chemical, the EPA didn't monitor it. They didn't monitor it in the environment, and they didn't monitor it except for to measure how much people were putting out there. The reason that they gave two reasons. Monsanto said, it's the bee's knees, it breaks down, it's not toxic. And the first studies, in fact, showed that if you put a little bit in the fish water, the fish are like, yes, so. You can spray it on your birds, and your birds are like, yes, so there's some Roundup. So the initial data actually showed that it was, in fact, pretty environmentally benign. The other reason that we didn't measure it, and this is the reason given by more careful people than I am, this is by the USGS, says that Monsanto and the EPA didn't bother to measure it because it's hard to measure, it's polar, and it's water soluble. So this is a picture of the glyphosate molecule itself. You can see that it's polar, and maybe you can see it's water soluble. Right here, this is its first metabolite. This is AMPA. The reason I have this up here is not to bore you with chemical images because nobody likes looking at these except for the chemistry people. But the AMPA is the first metabolite. Roundup glyphosate breaks to AMPA pretty quick, depending on the situation. And AMPA is just as toxic as glyphosate itself in many of its, where you find it, depending on where you find it and what it's supposed to be doing. So AMPA is a biologically active, important molecule, just as glyphosate is itself. So people, being what they are like, okay, you're spraying that on our food crops. Are we eating it? And I don't know if you remember, but back at the you know, in the middle of the 2000s, like 2005, everybody was like going crazy. They thought, oh, organic food, it has more vitamins and minerals, which is not true for the most part. Chicken, it's true for. But there was a study out of Stanford, and this study was a big meta-analysis. They crawled through the Web of Science, and they pulled out every place where you might find, where anybody looked for Roundup or glyphosate residue on food. And what they found, the meta-analysis, all these dark boxes over on this side show that there's a lower risk for contamination for organic produce. And they summarize this even better with the sentence, which I pulled right out of the text, which is detectable pesticide residues were found in 7% of your organic food and 38% of your conventionally grown food. This data, this paper was published in 2012. So imagine that most of the stuff is about 10 years old. Before I go on to the next slide to sort of update those particular numbers, I want to point out that this guy is your conventional strawberry farmer. He is wearing protective gear. He is wearing a face mask. He is spraying Roundup on strawberries that you are about to eat because look how red they are. They're about to go into a box and go to your grocery store. The strawberries are too toxic for him to stand in, but they're not too toxic for you to eat. All right, so since those publications, since that initial publications, the Europeans, I'm sorry to pick on the Europeans, but they started it. The Europeans invented a new way to use Roundup. And the story goes something like this. The wheat farmers in the western United States, when Monsanto went to make wheat, genetically modified wheat, the wheat farmers like, no, we're not having genetically modified wheat because we know how draconian you are, and when our seeds escaped our farm, you go and get our neighbors. We're not up for that. And it went all the way up to the court just below the Supreme Court, and the wheat farmers won. So on the market, out of all of the foods that we have that are genetically modified, which is most of our major foods, wheat is not included. So this gives farmers a brand new tool to use to harvest wheat. If you are a wheat farmer, you harvest wheat when it's that golden, you know, in the song, the golden waving stuff with the seeds on the top. It's dead, right? It's not green, it's brown, golden, if you want to be arty. And what the farmers do is they're like, okay, it's not dead yet, but I really want to harvest on Friday. So today's Monday, I'm going to spray my greenish crop with Roundup today. It's going to be dead by Friday. We call that process is called green burn down. Europeans started it, we brought it to the United States, but here's the problem. That means, so that is in fact, this is green burn down going on in action right here. This crop will be dead in 3 to 5 days. They can harvest it in 3 to 5 days. They'll send the combines out to cut it. They put it, it's just been sprayed, and they looked at the weather report. They don't want it rained on because you can't cut wet wheat. They're going to put it, they're going to cut it, it's going to go right to a silo. Then companies like Nabisco and Wonder Bread are going to buy it, and they're going to make your bread. That means that this Roundup didn't have any chance to meet rain, and it didn't have any chance to meet soil microbes. It didn't have any chance to break down, and it's going directly into our food, which I find that alarming. Okay, so here we have some heroic Europeans, to pick on the other Europeans. This is a Danish and German group right here. Isn't it a cute cow? We love our cows. We love to eat our cows and drink our cows and wear our cows. In this particular case, we were looking at the urine in, looking at the glyphosate levels in cow pee. And even in the back here, I think you can see that if you're a cow eating a conventional diet, maybe you guys have no idea what a cow eats, but cows eat, if you're getting like the fanciest, most beautiful steak and it's all marbled, that cow spent about 3 months in a feedlot eating corn. And corn is a genetically modified crop, so it's going to have Roundup residue and glyphosate residue in it. If you're eating, like that cow right there, that cow's in a field of a combination of soybeans and weeds. So Roundup is in our soybeans. I'm going to show you the scary number for that coming up. So if you're a cow and you're eating a conventional diet, you have measurable amounts, trace amounts nonetheless, but measurable amounts of glyphosate in your pee. If you are a cow living in a region, because Europe has these, a region where you're only allowed to have organic crop methods, you can see there's almost no glyphosate in their pee. There's still some, but not too much. These researchers went through and they're like, okay, cows, we're going to eat you. And they measured the glyphosate in kidney, liver, lung, spleen, muscles, intestines. And in fact, pretty much everywhere they looked in the cow, it had pretty equal levels of glyphosate, trace amounts, because that's nanograms per gram, that's nanograms per milliliter. Those are small amounts. Okay. These same researchers went and looked at the urine of people. And these particular people eat what you would call a conventional diet. They didn't bother to spend the extra money for organic food. And they compared the glyphosate levels in urines for people who are eating a conventional diet versus people who are eating an organic diet. And I'm sure that even in the back row, you can see that these numbers are different. All right, just going to warn you, this got published, but it's a correlation, not a causation. And it's a messy correlation at that, but I put it in here anyway because we don't have a lot of data on the impact of naturally encountered glyphosate on human health. Okay, but this is the best we have, which should tell you how crappy our state of knowledge is. They took people who were chronically healthy, I don't know if that's a thing, I just made that up, versus people who are chronically diseased. That is a thing. And they looked at the glyphosate levels in here, and although this relationship isn't super strong, it's got a p-value of 0.03, they didn't actually ask people what was wrong with them. They just said, are you chronically sick? Yes, here, pee in a jar. Okay, so I want to reiterate this point here. When I'm talking about glyphosate in our food, I'm talking about trace amounts. I'm not talking about the whole beer. I'm talking about the dregs in the cup here. It's a tiny amount. It is not a big amount. However, it has been consistently in our diet since 1998. So if you were born in 1998 or more recently than that, and your parents fed you a regular diet, you have been getting a constant low dose of glyphosate, of dietary glyphosate. And you should be wondering what that does, because you didn't sign up for that. I know you didn't sign up for that. I used beer to remind you guys that, or I mean, I'm assuming you heard this, but the Belgians who have the cleanest beer on the planet had to change their minds about that, because their beer has what? Glyphosate in it. Okay, yeah, I know. It's a sad thing when even your beer, but it's made out of wheat, people. Okay, this paper right here is maybe the next best that we can use to talk about the impact of glyphosate on human health. These particular researchers, and you want to ask me about Seralini at lunch, that's a horror story. These particular researchers got petri dishes and they put in umbilical cells, placental cells, and embryonic cells, all human. These are all human cells right here. They put them in that petri dish. They put below environmentally safe amounts of Roundup formulations, not glyphosate, but Roundup, as we use it in the environment. All the cells up and died. They just died. They use the fancy words, apoptosis and necrosis, but essentially the cells died. So human developmental cells don't like this stuff. Okay, so in 2016, this paper is just a little over a year old. Myers, who's this scientist who specializes in collating big data sets. He doesn't actually, so he's got like 20 researchers on there. The researchers did all the work. He put it together in one pile. They went through Web of Science and they found everything that we know about glyphosate and environmental impact and Roundup and human health and the health of non-target organisms. And the paper's long. I make my undergraduates read this. I'm not going to make you read it, but I'm going to highlight the things that I think are particularly frightening about this. 27 out of 109 British loaves of bread have Roundup in that. That's like 25% of your bread loaves in Britain have Roundup in them. In the United States, you can find glyphosate residue in 90% of your soybeans. 90% of your soybeans have glyphosate residue. If you want to worry about AMPA, and I tried to convince you at the beginning of this talk that you should worry about AMPA, also 96% of your soybeans have measurable amounts of AMPA in it. Okay, we're eating it. I hope I'm convincing you. There are only 2 places where we know for a fact that there are problems, and both of these studies are problematic. This particular study right here, if you guys are asking me at lunch about the drama that's associated with this. However, I think we can safely, Myers actually thinks we can safely conclude from this particular research that if you feed rats glyphosate, the rats are going to have liver and kidney damage because the Roundup interferes with the mitochondria. It always comes down to the mitochondria. The WHO, I'm sure you guys heard this, the WHO reclassified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to people. And everybody was like, oh, we need to ban it. But to put things in perspective, at like a month later, they also put bacon on that list. Okay, so this is a list of suspected health problems that have not been fully explored or even beginning to be explored. I'm going to go by these super fast. There's only one I want to focus on. It's an endocrine disruptor. I don't need to tell you guys who specialize in plastics what that means. It's bad. Antibiotic action of glyphosate. That's the one I'm going to talk about. It increases retinoic acid during fetal development, leads to birth defects. So if you happen to be living right near where the farmers are spraying that stuff and it's blowing into your face, watch out for birth defects. It's neurotoxic. The paper that explored this issue was actually supported by pilot data out of the worm lab, where one of my undergraduates looked at the neurotoxicity of Roundup. Damages ovaries, and the medical doctors find the bottom one particularly alarming. Because it has an antibiotic action, it drives antibiotic resistance. Okay, let's talk about this one, the antibiotic action of glyphosate. All right, so how does Roundup kill a plant? It's not the formulation that kills the plant, it's the glyphosate itself that kills the plant. Plants use this lovely shikimate pathway. The biochemist in here are going, yeah, I know what that is. And glyphosate interrupts it at a very particular part, and the plants can't make their aromatic amino acids, and they die. Takes them 3 to 5 days if they're not resistant at all. Okay, Monsanto used this point right here to really give us the hard sell on Roundup, because you guys aren't using the shikimate process. I'm not using the shikimate process. Your dogs, your cats, your parakeets, your chickens, your lizards, they're not using the shikimate process. What's the problem, Pochron? The problem is that some, but not all bacteria use the shikimate process. We don't know which ones. We would have to go through and ask a particular bacteria, do you use the shikimate process? And it's not like the bacteria say, yes, I do. It's not like you have a Star Trek tricorder. Fungus also use the shikimate process. So it kills more fungus than it does bacteria. We don't know what bacteria it kills. All right, just to hammer home this point, this is mean to show you at lunchtime unless you're vegetarian, but I have one for you too. This is a problem. This lunch right here didn't used to be a problem. In 1998, this was not a problem, but corn syrup in the Coke, that's made with Roundup Ready corn. We fry our healthy French fries in canola oil, that's a Roundup Ready crop. If you are eating at Burger King or McDonald's, it's not 100% beef. You are using a soy filler. Soy has what? Roundup. Cows that are eating Roundup Ready soy and corn, what do they have? They have Roundup. And if you're coming from a region where people are using green burn down, you are going to find Roundup in your burger bun. Okay, and I saw Larry didn't actually put out these cookies today, but the Chips Ahoy's were out there. You know what else you ate? Yeah, Roundup. I ate it too. Okay, so one of the things I want to convince you, aside from the science here, because I'm coming from sustainability, and some of the students that I'm going to tell you about, they're sustainability study students. This is a social justice issue. Back in 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics wrote this anguished white paper because they were caught between a rock and a hard spot. They want parents to feed their children fresh fruits and vegetables, but they had just read the Stanford study that said that 38% of your food has Roundup in it. And the opening line of their white paper, of the American Academy of Pediatrics white paper, says something like, we don't know what the long-term effect of pesticides on humans is, but we probably don't want to be feeding it to small children. Having said that, all children should eat fresh fruits and vegetables, and if you can afford it, you should feed your kid organic. Okay, so that means poor kids get the dirty food, and rich kids get the clean food. I think that's a problem. All right, so right now, this picture right here is my current research obsession. There are no baboons in this picture. Actually, to be fair, there are no worms yet either. So we've got this gut microbiome right here. We've got Roundup that's residue level but constant since 1998 impacting here. I'm not going to go through this whole graph. It's a fancy graph. I put this up because I'm in SoMAS. Like, I could have used wolves. I thought about using wolves for the Trophic Cascade, but I'm like, hey, I could use starfish. And here's the thing, the Trophic Cascade. If you are familiar with this particular Trophic Cascade, you know that if you take out the acorn barnacles, who cares? The ecosystem just keeps churning on. I mean, if you love acorn barnacles, you might be sad, but the whole ecosystem stays intact. If you, on the other hand, take out the starfish, what happens to this particular ecosystem is that the mussels have a heyday, and they take over the whole thing, and everything else goes away. So if we go back to this particular system right here with our microbes, some of these microbes are using the shikimate process. Some of those microbes are not using the shikimate process. Which ones? Who knows? Well, that's what I said. Oh, wait, before I tell you about the research that I'm doing here, another correlational study. Remember, glyphosate introduced into our diet in 1998 from soybeans. You can see starting, this is 1988, right here, but 1998, there's a whole spike here in irritable bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. Right here, if you're comparing 1990, pre-Roundup, and 2013, you can see that there's a really big difference in the rectal cancers. Now, we did a lot of things in 1998, aside from adding glyphosate to our food. This is definitely a correlational study, but I think this is what has my interest right now. Okay, so here's the experiment, which I could not do without Nolan. I took worms, and over the summer, okay, so I'm like a mad scientist. In my in my basement, I have developed super clean, super organic earthworms that have only lived in super clean soil from my backyard and eaten organic food, while 93% of it doesn't have Roundup. They eat filtered water, and they live in glass tanks. So hopefully, to the best of my ability, these worms, and then I watched out for epigenetic effects. You know, I pulled the babies out, and then I pulled the babies out, and then I have super clean worms, hopefully. And I took these super clean worms, and I fed them an organic diet. I had a matched set of worms that were in the same amount of soil, same amount of water, but they were eating the same lettuce, but I had sprayed and dried the lettuce with Roundup. So these worms were getting a lot of Roundup in their diet. Okay, so the next thing we did was, I didn't do this, I have not dissected an earthworm since high school, and I plan to keep it on that way. The students pulled out the intestine, and they made samples, and they gave it to a student and a graduate student in Nolan Daly's lab, and they are going to, there's Nolan, there's the student, wait, I don't want to jump the gun here. They are going to compare the gut microbiome of the worm that's eating a clean diet versus a worm that's eating exactly the same thing, but a particular Roundup formulation. All right, the student that is helping Nolan on this, I want to give a shout out to. She started in my worm lab when she was in high school. There have been so far 2 publications out of the worm lab, and there's 1 in review. Her name is on all 3 of them. She has moved mostly out of my lab into Nolan's lab, which makes me a little sad, but happy for Nolan. And she just last week got an invitation from Cold Spring Harbor to use CRISPR to look at breast cancer genes. So she's the bee's knees. Okay, I worked with Anne in January, and we made sure that there was actually Roundup in the soil. I didn't talk about it too much because it's a mess, but the half-life of Roundup is unpredictable. Sometimes it's 2 days, sometimes it's almost a year. We don't know. I was afraid, after I had been doing this to the worms, you know, I didn't feed them every day, you don't need to feed a worm every day, that there might not be any glyphosate in the soil, but Anne helped me determine that there was indeed. This is an ELISA plate. These are awesome undergraduate students. I'm sneaking in story 2 right here. I'm getting ahead of myself. But this one is doing her honors project with me. This one and this one will be doing their honors project with me next year. They are, those looks on their faces, they're not looking too happy. They're trying to figure out, they've made the graph from the ELISA plate, and they're trying to figure out if they need to unlog the data. I don't actually know the answer. I'm hoping Anne can help them. Okay, so here's what we know so far. Our contaminated soil had contamination. Yay, would have sucked if it didn't. And we can say that the microbial community in the soil is different than the microbial community in the earthworm digestive system, which is good because, you know, Nolan and I worried that the worm is so small that they could have the same microbiology, the worm in the dirt. So we know that that's not true, but we don't know the rest. I don't have an answer to that question yet. Stay tuned. Okay, right here, for people who don't know, these are earthworm cocoons. This is what it looks like when out in a couple of days, out will come 2 to 14 baby worms. They're a non-target organism. Okay, I mentioned the USGS, so actually I'm sure that Bruce would be on board with this because the USGS is like, you know, EPA, you're getting a little lazy for not figuring out how to measure this stuff, and they worked really hard on measuring the glyphosate and AMPA in not just our waterways, but in our rain, our snow, our ditches, our ponds, our rivers. Now remember, it's supposed to be, wait, I had that, look there. It's not supposed to be mobile, and it's not supposed to be persistent, and it's supposed to break down in water. Okay, I'm just cat's out of the bag. It's not. This is AMPA and glyphosate in the groundwater, in the large rivers, in our ditches, in our soils, in our sediments. Essentially, everywhere we look, we find low but measurable amounts of Roundup. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say Roundup. That's glyphosate and AMPA.
Go back. That second bar, is that wastewater treatment
Yeah.
plant?
Yes, it is.
Oh, bloody.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so this is a frequency, and they have so many graphs that I put in my original version. They're all equally ugly. So I just went with the one that caught everything. These are the detection in frequency in percent. So for instance, in the wastewater, 80% had it in soil, 95% of the soil samples they looked at had glyphosate and AMPA. Okay, I think out of everything that was the scariest in that particular slide, I find two parts pretty alarming. One, 70% of the rain and snow samples that they looked at, 70% had residue of glyphosate and AMPA. The other thing that should be alarming, that I think is alarming, is that you can find it in the Susquehanna and the Mississippi. Really? That's a lot of AMPA and glyphosate. Okay, and it's in every soil and every sediment sample. Okay, so isn't that a great picture? Look how many non-target organisms are there. But I really only going to talk about the worm for a minute. And the worm is awesome for a number of reasons. One of the reasons the worm is awesome is because it makes it onto the bioindicator list. The European Union has put together a list of bioindicators. It's not a big list. These animals are canaries in the coal mine. And my friend, the Yersinia foetida, the red wiggler, the compost worm, is on that list. So you take a worm, you put it in your hand. Hopefully you're wearing a glove, but if you don't, you'll probably live. And you squirt some Roundup on your hand. What's the worm going to do? Honestly, it bubbles, it sizzles, it oozes mucus, it curls up into a ball, and it dies. I'm not the one who did this. These guys did this. Those are the bubbles. That's like the oozing mucus. So if you take a worm and you spray it with Roundup, it's curtains. But of course, that's not usually how a worm encounters Roundup in the environment, or even glyphosate in the environment, right? Your worm is, even your top-dwelling worms are underground when you're spraying Roundup. So this is environmentally normal loads right here. This is a slide of earthworms, same guy, Yersinia foetida, 3 weeks after exposure, and you can see it's not doing so well, aside from the fact that we just sliced it open. The cell, there's no structure. It's a mess. If you wait at week 4 and you take out the worms, you can see that they've recovered. So if you use it at environmentally normal levels, you can actually get some healing going on. Okay. Okay, so I'm putting this in for you guys because I had to put some water in here. The only place where we've looked at bioaccumulation in earthworms is in a particular sediment worm. This guy accumulates Roundup. Okay, now I'm gonna creep you guys into my second story here. Not that way, this way. So in 2012, I started the worm lab for one particular reason. I had come from primatology, anthropology. I had been Pat Wright's postdoc for 5 years. We had published 20, 30 papers together. And the one thing that I had learned from working with Pat was that when you go to the field, you can only take one student. So you have to make sure that your one student has the highest GPA, your one student is the sweetest, nicest, and is not going to cry when they're covered with leeches. And like really, there were virtually every student in sustainability wanted to do research. So I'm sitting around, Martin was my boss at the time, and I'm sitting around and I'm like, well, what's the cheapest research that I can get students involved in? I'm like, what's dirt cheap? Oh, dirt and worms. That's how I came up with this. When I first set it up, I had my very first semester, 12 students volunteered to spend all of their free time in the life sciences greenhouse, which is where we're located. And after about a semester of this, and I'm not getting paid for this, and I didn't know anything about worms and dirt. At lunch, you can ask me about all the ways I screwed up studying worms and dirt. It's kind of funny. But after that, Ginny Clancy, who has a golden halo, said to me, hey, Sharon, why don't you turn it into a class? Instead of, so you're not stuck putting all your free time into the worm lab, invent a class. So I designed these 2 classes. The first class is design and implement a research project in ecotoxicology. I run this one in the fall. And this one I run in the spring. It's conduct and communicate a research project in ecotoxicology. Essentially what I do is I get about 30 students per semester. I divide them, they divide themselves really, into groups of 5 or 6, depending on how many students. They pick the projects. The registrar lets you take each class twice. So some of my students spend their whole lives in the worm lab because you can take each class twice and then you can take it as 487. So literally some of my students, that's all they do is worm lab. And the first semester, they learn how to design. They write grants for Eureka to get supplies. They come up with questions. I help them figure out what's going to work and what's not. And then in the final semester right here, they have to present at Eureka. The other thing that we do which I have a slide coming up for, is we publish in peer-reviewed scientific journals because these students are that kind of awesome. Oh, I'm jumping the gun here. So when I designed these two classes, they came to the attention of Eliza Riley, and NCSCE just moved about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, here to Stony Brook campus. And the NCSCE here is the National Center for Science and Civic Engagement. And once Eliza Riley, who's the big cheese over there, probably organic cheese, realized what I was doing, she made this class sensor model, which is her signature initiative. And I want to go back a minute. The thing that makes the NCSCE awesome is that they make connections. I'm just going to read this bold part. They make connections between the content that professors teach and real-world issues of civic importance. So when I first started this, and I said to my students, now you guys know I wanted to study Roundup. When I said to my students, what do you want to study? They all said acid rain. So our first project was actually acid rain. Shudder. Okay. And after Eliza realized that what we were doing in this class, she made it a sensor model. Now, the sensor model is the signature initiative of the NCSCE. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of things here. Sensor models are classes, right? They're not like mathematical models. Are curricular approaches to improving science learning and supporting engagement with complex issues. Sensor models reflect the intellectual curiosity of the faculty, thank God I can study Roundup, who develop them. At the same time, they respond to student interests, including personal interests, as well as public or civic ones. Okay. So this is actually off their website. They made the Worm Lab series of classes into a sensor model. I look so cool right there, don't I? Because this is me like taking a selfie. I had to stand on a desk. Okay, I am not that cool. They had to tell me how to take that picture. All right, so that's the Worm Lab. Okay, so between 2012 and maybe 2014, we spent a lot of time figuring out how we're going to measure the impact of a particular ecotoxin on earthworms. Because our first attempt of measuring the effect of Roundup, it failed colossally for actually funny reasons. And this is what we've come up with. And when I say we, I actually mean we. My students play just as big of a role in this as I do. We create populations of earthworms. Sometimes we use my super awesome organic ones. Sometimes we use ones that are living in plastic bins. We expose the worms for a month to particular ecotoxins. We do a head count about how many worms survive this. The survivorship is almost always super high because it's really hard to kill the worms, which is funny. We measure their body weight, and we invented a stress test, and we measure how long they survive the stress test. To do the stress test, it takes place in the, quote, growth chambers. We turn the lights up super high. We turn the temperature up super high. We put the worm in a petri dish. It's like being on a super hot sidewalk, and we wait for them to die. If there's a worm hell, I'm going to it. Okay, so what does Roundup do to worms? Now, you guys know I'm a primatologist, so I'm just going to fast forward through the first 3 semesters that we just bungled everything. We found, and it was true, I thought it was me and my students, but it's true across the literature. The impact of an ecotoxin on an earthworm is pretty vexing, and it's true for Roundup, but it's also true for cadmium, zinc, whatever, lead, whatever else we want to subject an earthworm to. You kind of work under the assumption that if a worm has to battle an ecotoxin, it's going to be using its metabolic energy to, combat the toxin. And instead, what we find, oh my gosh, really, this is true. Roundup exposed worms are frequently, and in this particular study, which is in review right now with Chemosphere, they get bigger. They get bigger. Really, worms? Why would you do that? So we had designed this particular project, which my students did over a winter when I was not even home. We tried to figure out what was making worms sensitive to Roundup and what made worms go, yeah, we don't care. And what we did is we put them in hot tanks and cold tanks, and we used large worms and small worms because, unbeknownst to many people, the red wiggler can be super small or kind of big. Like, they range in body size from like 0.1 gram to about 0.8 grams. It's a pretty big difference. And when we did this study, oh my gosh, wait, worms, you're so vexing. Okay. But then we did our stress test, and we started finding things that made more sense, when you think about an earthworm as a metabolic creature. And you can see over here, we've got worms from hot tanks, and we have worms from cold tanks, and we've got worms that were small and large. But over here, oh no, those are all from hot tanks. Over here, these are all worms from cold tanks. So If they're coming from cold tanks and they're going into the super hot growth chamber, they die, and they've been living in Roundup, they're like, ah, and they die. They actually do the mucus thing and curl up into balls, and it's not always so pretty. Okay, so that particular, so how did we interpret this? We interpreted this to mean that exposing worms to 2 toxins, 2 stressors, cause more harm than subjecting them to 1. Okay, this reference right now, like I said, this one's in review. I just want to give a shout out to some of these students. This guy right here is starting at Stony Brook School of Medicine in September. This one is starting in the graduate program in Ecology and Evolution in September. This one, and this one are heading to med school. They have med school aspirations. This one wants to go to vet school. This one right here is on the fence between environmental law and conservation biology. And this one right here is the same one that I share that I used to share with Nolan. Okay, so the civic issues. One of my students, those are both one of these papers, which one? This one came out last year, this one came out this month. These are the newest papers to come out of the worm lab. In fact, I'm just going to point out, that's me and 12 undergraduate students. That's me and a mix of undergraduates, and there's 1 or 2 high school students in there. These students came to me. One of the kids was a soccer goalie, and he was eating a lot of crumb rubber. So if you have paid any attention, on school grounds, we're ripping out the grass and we're putting in crumb rubber fields. These little things right here, if you had a kid who's an athlete, or if you are an athlete yourself, you know that they get in your car, they get in your foyer, they get in your bathroom, they get in your shoes, they get in your socks. And if you're a goalie and you're diving onto the ground 50 times per hour, they get into your mouth and into your intestine. And that's a little bit scary because the crumb rubber is made out of recycled tires. Now, we don't know what else to do with recycled tires. What we do with recycled tires, that's a whole problem right there. I don't have a solution to that. But the thing about recycled tires, they have cadmium. It's a known carcinogen, a heavy metal. They have benzene, known carcinogen. It's got PFOAs, a whole suite of plasticizers. I can't remember the whole alphabet soup of plasticizers it has. These are bad things. I mean, the geneticists should be wanting to collect that plant and say, genes, what genes are in that? Okay, so the first thing that we did is we took virgin crumb rubber. We took it, the place where one of the kids was playing soccer, had just put down a new field, and we borrowed a bag and took the crumb rubber out. It had never been in the sun, never in the rain. It's super clean. And as clean as recycled tires get, I have to be fair here. And we made worms live in them, and I was pretty surprised that the worms didn't just up and die. Most of the worms lived through this. But it decreased their weight gain trajectory by 14%. That's significant. This was published in Chemosphere. And then our follow-up paper, God, I don't remember what journal, it has a long name. This one was just published, and we looked at aged crumb rubber. So, you know, if you take a plastic and you make it sit in the sun and the freezing for years, you might expect that it breaks down some of the toxins in it. And we wondered whether that made the crumb rubber more toxic or less toxic. And what we found was that living in the contaminated soil, this kind of result I have a lot of faith in. These guys are living for 200 minutes. These guys are living for 240 minutes. So if you are coming from the clean crumb rubber, you get a whole 40 minutes more of life. Okay, so we had mixed the crumb rubber together with soil, and we worked with the Cornell Nutritional Analysis Laboratory to figure out how much heavy metal was in here. A lot of noise up here. Only thing that you really need to pay attention to is zinc. There's a super high amount of zinc in both the aged and the virgin crumb rubber. So zinc is what we think, I didn't do that on purpose, we think that zinc might be our culprit. So we are working with a group of high school students out of Sayville High School who get this great genetics training, and they know how to take a tissue sample off the worm, purify the DNA. We only look at mitochondrial DNA, and they're looking for micromutations in the DNA. We suspect that we're going to find that living in crumb rubber damages the mitochondrial DNA, and we think that it might, in fact, hit the nucleotides. All right, so these are all of the students. I think I gave them the shout out that let me just see if there's anybody else here that needs a, okay, so one of these students up here is humanities, an environmental humanities major. She was awesome. This student right here was visiting from Johns Hopkins, He is this summer he has this summer landed in RU at Harvard. Yeah. This kid is an engineering student here. That one went to McMaster's to study environmental science. Okay, so I'm just going to pop through these questions real quick and take questions. These are I'm going through these too fast. These projects going on right here are the students' projects that I have nothing to do with. This is their idea. They want to know whether the different flavors of Roundup are differently toxic. We actually don't know the answer to that. And the formulation that we use with glyphosate is top secret. We don't know what it is, but Monsanto won't tell us, and the EPA won't make them tell us. Okay, then these guys got super busy. These two guys work on everything together, and they've done more projects than I can actually describe right here. But they are looking at, usually we wait a month after exposure. These kids are looking at week 1, at week 2, at week 3, at week 4. These, Niels, you don't have any pictures of Ian on your website. Otherwise, I'd have Ian up here too. Ian in Niels's lab has designed this super cool camera that looks at changes in topography. And you can see that worms change the topography of soil. And these students working with Ian Dwyer have added Roundup to some of these tanks and have the camera above, and they're looking at worm activity. Okay, this is this looks like a joke. Town of Brookhaven, this is not a joke, this is not a lie, makes compost that will give to you for free. All those leaves you put on the side of the road, they pick up in the fall, then they add horse poop, cow poop, and sheep poop from all of the local horse growers, sheep growers, cow growers in the town of Brookhaven. They make compost out of it. My students were like, okay, well, once they learned that they were worming the horse, we call it worming. It's actually deworming. You put the medicine in the horse, it kills the worms and the chemical come out in the poop. The poop goes into the compost. My students wanted to know whether peas bioaccumulated. If you grow the peas in dirty soil, are you eating horse wormer when you eat peas, is essentially their question. I had nothing to do with that question. Okay, and then this is another question that I had nothing to do with, and these particular students have been asking about plant translocation, how much chemical the plants are translocating, and one of the students who I actually think is here, he was like, okay, Pochron, but if you make the worm grow with a genetically modified seed, how does it fare if you make the worm grow with with an organic seed? And we should have answers to that pretty soon, because we're waiting for the plants to dry. Okay, that's what I got for you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for letting me talk to you. Yeah.
So we started looking at, in the environmental micro, had a couple of graduate students and actually the undergraduates also, looking at the Roundup with your soil and just with forest soil and all.
Yeah.
And we were looking at the effect on the microbes or bacteria and fungi.
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't clear cut. And maybe we have, you'd have to run it for longer, but didn't kill off the microbes right away. And maybe when Con was actually involved in that
Yeah.
project. But I think it's worth
That paper that Myers paper that I put up from 2016 where they had gone through, it's a consensus paper, and their major conclusion is that given that it's in all of our food and you can imagine pathways where it causes damage, it behooves us to measure everything that we can to start thinking about this, because we're eating it, and some of us have been eating it our whole lives. Us old people, it's not probably such a problem for, but for people from 1998 on, it might be a problem. Yeah.
Sharon, you mentioned the epiptosis study earlier
Yeah.
on. Do you remember the concentration used in that study and how they compare to the concentration found in body fluids from humans?
Yeah. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they made a big deal about them being pretty low levels and below the levels that we consider safe by the CDC and the EPA consider safe. So, and I don't know if they compared it to other body fluids. I don't remember. The paper came out. I don't remember, but I have it on my computer. I'm happy to show it to you. All right. Sorry. Yeah.
So on the tire
Yeah.
aspect of things, I'm wondering, you concentrated on fields,
Yeah.
athletic fields, and the larger particles. But of course, all those tires that all of us use are wearing down all the time. So there's a tremendous flux of
Yeah.
much smaller particles.
The residue getting into the groundwater.
It's
Yeah.
in the air. It's,
Yeah.
it's around any highway. There's
Yeah.
a halo of these particles as tires wear down.
Yeah.
And you know, because you probably had to replace your tires, that all the stuff that was removed goes into the environment.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what the disseminated, what the effect of small disseminated particles might be in this context on the
Yeah.
entire ecosystem, because it's much less controlled
Right.
than it's more like the Roundup issue in terms
Yeah,
of
it's everywhere.
acid.
What do you do with the fact that it's everywhere?
Yeah.
Well, the literature that I know very well that has to do with the tires is mostly worried about the crumb rubber athletic fields, because if you are taking kids or grandkids to play on them, you are making small children play in recycled tires, which has cadmium and zinc, and there's not even that many, less than 50 papers on this topic. And the researchers on an Italian pitch, they took a whole bunch of soccer players, and I don't know if you're familiar with them. Like, my kid's a soccer player, so if you stand on that in the summer, you can smell it. And they compared the air quality and the components that make air stinky over the Italian pitches to other places. And they concluded that the amount of contaminant, and I don't remember specifically which things that they were looking at, because there are literally hundreds, was about the same as standing next to the LIE during rush hour. So, and if you're paying attention to the news at all, you know that they just put out numbers for how many heart diseases are being caused by dirty air in the United States. So if you wanted to go down that rabbit hole, there are enough crumbs that lead you there in a logical way. But I haven't been down that rabbit hole yet. So.
Maybe they've stopped doing this, but for a while they were putting the ground-up tires in as soft material for playgrounds.
That's where it came from. Yeah.
I mean, that's younger kids and
Yes.
100% tires.
Yeah, it's not 100% tire, because the way that they make it, if you really care, is they take a bulldozer and they make it flat. They put down sand to make it flatter. They put down a plastic layer, which is, to keep it from leaching. Like, anybody's going to vacuum this stuff up, right? It's going everywhere but back to the landfill. They put down the plastic, then they put down a layer, then they put down the crumb rubber, and then they put down the grass. And there are 2 flavors of this particular kind. So Sayville High School is all up in arms. Mount Sinai High School is all, we're using the safe kind. And really the only safe one is cork, and just talk about endangered species there. So yeah, there's not, like, I don't know what we should be doing with our tires, but I don't think that making our small children play on them seems like such a great idea. So anyway, I'm hoping that the mitochondrial DNA will give us a scarier answer than people actually have right now. Yeah, Kamazima.
Yeah, so when you started, one of the properties you listed is this thing is water soluble.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you seem to be surprised that it was found in water and precipitation.
Yeah, the USGS was surprised by that. They were expecting it to be nowhere. Yeah. So.
It's supposed to
decompose quickly.
So I can give you the author's Badaglan, and his email's on the front of the paper. I'm not taking that one on. You can have it. Yeah. Yeah, Carl.
How does it aerosolize to get up in clouds?
I don't think I know the answer to that question. I think that one of the ways, so we know that one way that it aerosolizes is during the application process. So when we look for cancer clusters, because of any herbicide, not just Roundup, but any herbicide, the first places that we look are the farming communities that live adjacent to fields. And we know that they have higher impact, and you can find it in their house dust. Their kids get leukemia at a slightly higher rate. And that comes from the dust. If it's clean, so like Roundup is pretty happy to clean the soil. And then if it's a dusty day, it's going to travel into your house. And as you're applying it, it's actually going to get into the air that way too. So it doesn't stay where you put it.
So one more thing, the cows, the tissue loading in the
Yeah.
cows that you showed, the lungs were the highest.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if when a cow sticks its nose into the
Yeah.
feed material and the small particles that are in that material get into its lungs, if that's one of the primary entry points.
You could make your whole new rabbit hole about that. I actually think that's a very strong rabbit hole. And if you think about the next step, if you think about other things that put their faces right in the dirt, I would go with small children. So, yeah.
Great.
Yeah. All right.